The last time we saw this car, we had just taken the wheels off of it for the first time. We got new tires installed onto those wheels, but before they go back on the car, there are a few things we should take care of. And we'll start by refreshing some of the main components in the braking system. I imagine it's a hardly controversial statement to say that brakes are pretty important. Just about everything except for the pads appears to be original. That means it's all 28 years old. For starters, we have a master cylinder rebuild kit, brake caliper hardware kit, brake caliper seal kits, all new brake hoses, a drum brake hardware kit, and 2 new wheel cylinders. It's worth mentioning that it often isn't worth it anymore to rebuild calipers and master cylinders. On our 88 S10 Blazer, when we replaced the calipers and master cylinder with remanufactured units, the total cost was under $50. Even just considering parts prices, it might not be possible to beat that using rebuild kits. There's also a good chance we won't be able to finish parts as nicely as a remanufacturing plant would, so if it wasn't for the purpose of making this video, I probably would have just went the remanufactured route again. In this case, I was able to get a good deal on the parts, so doing the work was cheaper, but obviously there's more labor involved. For a lot of other vehicles, parts won't be available as commonly and cheaply as these, and rebuilding them yourself is sometimes the only viable option. Also, if you do the work yourself, at least you know it was done the right way. Or in our case, at least it was done. On any vehicle you buy, it's always a good idea to flush out the brake fluid and bleed everything, but this one needs a little bit more work than that. Near as I can tell, the brakes work just fine, but some of these components are definitely concerning. For starters, just look at the front brake hoses. The braided inner section is still intact, which is why they hold pressure, but the rubber outer protective part is completely torn. When brake hoses fail, it's usually at one of the rigid metal connections. In this case, it's where the hose passes through the bracket, attaching it to the strut. This is the driver's side front brake hose, and while the passenger side doesn't look quite as bad, we will definitely be replacing both. This side doesn't appear to be torn at all, and the steel parts aren't as rusted. It must have been protected by that grass and all of the spider webs. Without a doubt, it would be a good idea to replace the front brake hoses. So while we're at it, we might as well replace the front brake line, and we might as well rebuild the calipers, and we might as well rebuild the master cylinder. We'll start by removing the cap and seal on the master cylinder and removing as much fluid as possible. In the first episode of this series, we already replaced the fluid in the master cylinder, and look how grungy it is already. This is a pretty good indication that not only should all of the fluid be replaced, but there's a lot of buildup inside of the brake system. We'll remove the fluid from the master cylinder just like before by using a big syringe. These 100 milliliter syringes are just the best. They're super cheap and super useful for transferring fluids like this. Just make sure not to accidentally use it for anything else after using it for automotive fluids. Also, no matter how tempting they might look, stay away from any open beverage containers that have been in my garage. It should be noted that it's not a good idea to completely drain the master cylinder unless you plan on bleeding it before using it. If you aren't planning on bleeding it again, pressing the brake pedal down just a little bit with a heavy object will close the valve in the master cylinder and limit the amount of brake fluid that will drip out. But here we want to get out as much fluid as possible to reduce the mess, since everything will be coming out of the car. And with that pretty much empty, we'll start by disassembling the front brakes on the driver's side. We'll spray some oil on the flare nuts and the hose clip, which will hopefully help us disassemble everything more easily. Here we're just using regular WD-40, but whatever magic formula of penetrating fluid you prefer to use will work just fine. Using a flat blade screwdriver and some needle nose pliers, we'll push and pull on the brake hose clip at the same time and pull it out of place. Then we'll be able to slide the brake hose free of the bracket. To disconnect the side of the hose that's threaded onto the hard line, we'll hold the hose still with an open end wrench and use a flare nut wrench on the side of the hard line in order to give us the best odds at removing it without rounding it off. Even if you don't plan on reusing these parts, it's always a good idea to remove them as non-destructively as possible if time allows. It took a significant amount of force, but the nut broke loose and it seems to be spinning just fine. What will often happen with rusty brake line is the line will seize to the nut and it will spin the line as you try to remove it. If you try to keep unthreading it, it'll twist and destroy the brake line. With that line disconnected and the fluid dripping onto the control arm, you don't really want to let it do that because brake fluid will remove any coatings and cause the metal to rust. But sometimes it's kind of unavoidable. Here, it was avoidable and I just didn't do anything about it. Even if you're not trying too hard, it's still a good idea to keep wiping the brake fluid up and not let it sit on the steel. Definitely don't get brake fluid near any painted surfaces like body panels. Anyway, with the line disconnected, we need to remove another brake clip that's holding the hose to this bracket. This one we'll just grab with channel locks and wiggle it until it pops out. And now the brake hose can be fully removed from the pair of brackets. The last thing to remove is the banjo bolt holding the hose to the caliper. This one is very straightforward to remove, and we'll just use the impact gun to spin it loose. Then we'll unthread the bolt by hand and completely remove the hose. It should be noted that there is a drain pan sitting on the floor beneath the caliper. It'd be silly to let all this fluid go to waste. We'll carefully remove the banjo bolt from the hose and retain both copper washers. Often brake hoses will include new washers, and it's definitely a good idea to use them. However, sometimes you just have to make do. In this case, we'll hang on to the old washers, but we will be using new ones. And now that we have the hydraulics disconnected, we need to unbolt the brake caliper. Like many other GM vehicles of this and earlier eras, these calipers use two slide bolts that need to be removed with the hex key. You can usually get an impact gun on both of them if you turn the wheel far enough, but in this case we'll just unthread them the old-fashioned way. And once both of the slide bolts have been removed, we can slide the caliper off of the spindle. It's a little easier said than done when it hasn't been removed in quite a while, but with a little bit of persistence we have everything taken off. Do try and take care not to drop the brake pads. We'll take the caliper over to the workbench and start disassembly. The very first thing we'll do is break loose the bleeder screw and make sure it's gonna come out. It's a bit scary using it on such a small fitting, but I've had more success using an impact gun to remove bleeder screws than anything else. Basically, apply some penetrating fluid, a little bit of heat, and hit the caliper right near the bleeder screw to loosen it up, and then hit it with the impact gun. With any other kind of wrench, you're putting a lot of side load on the bleeder, which seems to be what tends to break them. The impact gun keeps the force centered on the bleeder. Also, no matter what you're doing, definitely use a 6-sided socket. With the bleeder screw removed, it's now obvious that this caliper has been repaired before. There's a threaded insert in the caliper, which means either the threads were stripped out, or more likely somebody broke a bleeder screw off of it, then drilled and tapped it for a threaded insert and a new, smaller bleeder screw. The repair appears to have been done correctly, and the brakes didn't exhibit any issues, so we'll just leave it alone. Next, we'll use channel locks to remove the steel slide pin guides from the caliper. These guides, or bushings, or whatever you want to call them, are retained in the caliper by little rubber inserts. Once the steel parts have been removed, we'll fish out the rubber inserts on all 4 hold-down points. Here we're using an O-ring pick to push them out of place, but a flat blade screwdriver would certainly do the job. And once we've pried all 4 of those out of the caliper, the only thing left is the piston assembly. We'll do a quick comparison of the new seals versus the old ones and make sure it seems like everything is the right size. And after careful measuring and an intense half a second of calibrated eyeball comparison, yeah, they're probably right. So we'll keep moving and get the piston separated from the caliper. First, we'll thread back in the bleeder screw. It doesn't have to be tight, just enough to keep too much air from getting past it. The simplest way to pop out the piston is by using compressed air. It's a lot less pressure than the hydraulic braking system, but the pressurized air should be enough to extend the piston. A small piece of vacuum hose on the end of the blowgun nozzle provided a good seal. Start the air pressure low and only ramp it up as necessary. That way you don't accidentally, placing a thin wooden board on top of the piston can also help keep everything controlled. And now that the piston has been safely and carefully removed on the first try, we can get out the seals. The outermost seal is the dust boot, and this one has clearly seen better days. The dust boot is a steel-clad seal, so the easiest way to remove it is by deforming the outer edge with a chisel or screwdriver. Just be careful not to scratch up any sealing surfaces. And with that out of the way, we can easily remove the square-cut piston seal. And once we unthread the brake bleeder again, the caliper has been completely disassembled. It's pretty amazing that such a simple device can be so effective at stopping a vehicle. Once again, we'll compare the new parts to the old ones, and since everything seems about right, we'll go ahead and clean everything up. Once the piston has been sprayed off with brake clean to remove any oil residue, we'll use Scotch-Brite to polish it up. This red Scotch-Brite is a good choice because it's tough enough to remove any residue and leave a nice shiny finish, but soft enough that it won't damage the part. The most important area to clean is the outer circumference. That's where that square-cut seal rides in the bore. And once that's looking nice and shiny, we'll move on to the caliper itself. Again, we'll spray it off with brake clean, this time making sure to get the passages as well. Then we'll use our Scotch-Brite to clean up that inner piston bore surface as well as possible. This caliper had some rust present right below the sealing surface, so we'll want to clean that up really well. We'll also clean up the rusted threads and the sealing surface on the brake bleeder screw. A simple wire wheel is a good choice for this job. And just like that, we're back on the bench with our cleaned old parts and new parts all laid out. The finish of the piston is even and shiny all the way around, and the same goes for the bore in the caliper. In order to get things reassembled properly, we need to oil the seals. We'll pour a little bit of brake fluid into this clean cap and use that to lubricate everything. First up is the new square cut seal. Once the whole thing has a light coating of oil, we'll pop it into place inside of the caliper bore. We'll add some extra oil to aid installation of the piston and make sure the piston is oiled as well. On this side, we installed the dust seal onto the piston after pressing it into the bore, while on the other side we installed the seal and then pressed the piston in. Both ways work, but it probably is easier to install the seal onto the piston before installing it into its bore. Because that square cut seal needs to be compressed and it is a tight fit, the easiest way for us to install this piston is going to be using the vise. It's important to take your time with this step and make sure the piston is completely square with the bore so that you don't end up damaging parts by trying to force the piston in at an off angle. We'll use a thin board to spread out the force over the face of the piston and a socket so that we can direct the force where we want it. What worked well here was to get the piston started into its bore using a small amount of force and then kind of moving things around every time it got tight. By moving around the socket in the vise, we're moving around the point that we're using to press things together so we can reduce the chances of pushing too hard while the piston is cocked in its bore. When we ran out of space with the thin board, we switched it out for a 2x4 and pushed the piston a bit farther in. We'll stop while the lip for the dust seal is still above the surface of the caliper. That way we can take the oiled dust boot and work it over the end of the piston. Once the inner surface is fully in the groove on the piston, we need to press the outer surface into the caliper. We'll get it most of the way there just pressing by hand, and then we can fully compress the piston. We'll use the 2x4 in the vise again and press until the piston is just about flush with the caliper surface. Once again, if things are positioned correctly, it shouldn't take a ton of force. So now we need to come back and make sure the dust seal is fully pressed into place. We can see that it's not yet flush all the way around. A tool that worked really well for pressing this in was a chisel with the plastic guard still attached. Something similar, like a plastic scraper with a dull blade, would be a good tool to push the seal fully into place without damaging it. We're using light taps and only pushing on the very outside edge and not on the bellows. At the end of this process, the outer edge of the seal was a little bit below flush with the caliper surface and even all the way around. This part of reassembly should be done, but we'll double check to make sure everything is working before we finish putting it together. We'll apply a liberal amount of anti-seize to the threads and only the threads of the bleeder screw and thread it back into place. We'll also tighten it down, just snug for now, as we'll have to loosen it during the bleeding process anyway. Then we'll go ahead and put our 2x4 back in the caliper and air check the piston. It took around 80 psi to pop out the piston when disassembling it. For this test, we'll use around 30. It seems like everything moves freely and easily, and we can't hear any leaking air. You can run that air check at pretty much any pressure you want, but I'm pretty confident in our piston seal, so we'll leave it at that. We'll check all the way around to make sure that the dust seal hasn't moved and that it's still in its groove on the piston. Since everything looks good, we'll go ahead and fully compress the piston again so that the caliper is ready to accept pads. Just like when using the vise earlier, it's fine to use channel locks to compress the piston as long as you're not putting too much force in at any one spot. If the piston is putting up a fight, that's because it's not going in straight, so don't force it. The seal still looks good and we're really finished with the hydraulics, but for the finishing touch we'll cap off the banjo bolt fitting. Remanufactured calipers usually come with these caps, and it's nice to keep them around for stuff like this. They'll help keep in the brake fluid used for assembly and keep out anything else. The last thing to do is reinstall the rubber rings for the slide pins. We'll spray each one with a little bit of WD-40 to help get them into place. It's easy enough to press them in by hand, just make sure they're fully in their grooves and even all the way around. And once all four of them are in place, we'll reinstall the steel guide bushings. Once again, a little bit of WD-40 will aid this install and they can be pressed in by hand. And that's it, we're done. This caliper has been rebuilt. We're not going to worry about painting these or anything, we're just going for functionality, but that certainly is an option. And since we're done, we can... oh yeah, the other side. The process for the other side is exactly the same, although this time it starts with removing some decorative grass. I just don't understand why manufacturers keep putting stuff like that on all new cars. We'll break loose the flare nut, disconnect the line from the hose, remove the two brake hose clips, remove the banjo bolt and the brake hose. Then out come the 2 caliper bolts, and we'll slide off the caliper and remove the brake pads. Then, on the bench, we'll spray some oil on the bleeder screw and make sure we can break it loose. This side does not have a repair and has the original, larger bleed screw. We'll knock out the steel bushings for the slide bolts and then remove all of the rubber rings. Then, with the bleeder screw threaded back in, we'll use compressed air to carefully extract the piston. You definitely could leave the bleeder screw in until after this step, but I don't really like the surprise of breaking one off, and I'd like to get that out of the way ASAP. This piston extended easily with only 60 psi, although it sealed so well that it actually shot my little piece of rubber hose up into orbit. But no matter, we'll borrow a piece of vacuum hose from one of the cars and get back to work. Once the piston has been safely extended most of the way out of its bore, we can pull it the rest of the way out by hand. Then we'll remove the dust seal with a chisel and the inner piston seal with a pick. And with the bleeder screw back out, we'll get to cleaning up all the parts. And with everything cleaned up in the same way as the other side, we'll get to installing our new seals. We'll install the square cut piston seal, and then this time we'll install the dust boot onto the piston while it's outside of the caliper. Then we'll press the piston into the bore using the vise again, and gently tap the dust boot fully into place. Then we'll reinstall the bleeder screw with anti-seize and perform another air test to make sure everything is working as it should. It passes the function test with flying colors, so we'll cap it off and reinstall the rubber slide pin rings and the steel bushings. And there we go, just like that we have rebuilt 2 brake calipers. But what about the rear brakes? This car has discs up front and drums in the rear. Earlier we mentioned having new wheel cylinders, but we don't plan on installing those just yet. Of course, it's also possible to rebuild wheel cylinders, and since they're even more simple than calipers, it's pretty straightforward. In this case, once we do work on the wheel cylinders, we'll just be replacing them since new ones can be had for just a couple of dollars. The reason we'll be replacing them later is because we won't be working on the rear brake lines just yet. We've already seen that they're plenty rusty, and I definitely want to replace all the brake lines on the car, but we'll just start with the front since they do the most work and are the most important. This way, even if the rear brake lines do spring a leak, they'll only drain the back half of the master cylinder and the fronts will still work. Anyway, all we'll do for now is check on the rear drum brakes and clean them up. Before we go any farther, we'll also check to make sure that the bleeder screw will come out in one piece. Luckily, we were able to loosen the bleeders on both sides without a huge fight. Just like with the calipers, we'll leave the bleeder screws just snug for now, since we'll have to loosen them to bleed the brakes later. Also luckily, the drums weren't too stuck, and we were able to remove both by hand. With the drum off, we can see that everything inside appears to be in decent shape. The shoes have plenty of material left, and everything is where it should be. There's no signs of fluid leakage, and the dust boots are still in place on the wheel cylinder. The drum itself also appears to be in decent shape. To wash out the brake, we'll start by just dousing the whole thing with water. This will wash off some of the brake dust and help keep the rest from becoming airborne when we spray it out. And once everything has been soaked with water, we'll spray it down with some brake cleaner. They're not exactly sparkling, but at least they're cleaner than they were. And we'll give the same treatment to the brake drum, cleaning it out as well as we can. And with everything somewhat clean, we'll reinstall that brake drum and check the other side. We performed the same cleaning and checks on the passenger side brake drum, and luckily everything seems good there too. So, since there aren't any obvious failures, we'll proceed with the plan to leave the rear brakes alone for now. And that seems like as good a place as any to end this episode. Next time we'll work on the master cylinder, replace the front brake lines, and get everything reinstalled.